So today, for unfamiliar, I'm going to give you a lesson on dopamine. And so I'm reading this book right now called The Molecule of More. I would definitely recommend reading it if you haven't seen it before. But essentially just explains dopamine in every facet of life in which it is used and which could help you utilize it to your advantage. So it's obviously going to be demonized because essentially what dopamine is, it is a forward-looking neuromodulator in your brain. And so it is what is behind anticipation of the future, excitement. So a good example of this is in the beginning of relationships when it's in the honeymoon period. You are constantly thinking about all of the possibilities of the future and you're imagining many things. That releases a lot of dopamine, and that is essentially the honeymoon phase. Another example is if a coffee shop has opened up near you or you have a favorite food. This is going to release a lot of dopamine when you think about it and when you eat or drink the coffee or food. Now, what is very common is the more you eat your favorite food, the less it becomes your favorite food. Or in relationships, the honeymoon phase does not last. And so this is the one caveat with dopamine is it's never going to last forever. It's always temporary, because as soon as the thing that you imagine and that you want and that you reach for becomes in your possession, dopamine is no longer released. And so as soon as you can comfortably expect something and there's no surprise, there is no anticipation anymore, dopamine is gone. So there was a study where there's actually just rats in a cage and they were fed little pebbles. And the more pebbles that the rats were fed, the less dopamine was released, until eventually none was at all, because it was predictable. There was no more surprise, there was no more anticipation. It was a normal part of life. And that's how dopamine works. And so a lot of people, when they get into relationships, get into the 1-2 year mark, start to not feel as much, or things start to fade and they're not as exciting and you're not constantly thinking about each other. And they think this is a bad sign for the relationship. And I'm obviously not one to give you any relationship advice, but this is directly from the book. And essentially, and this makes sense because it happens to literally everyone, is these things fade, but they don't fully go away. But the dopamine does, and so the excitement does. And people think this is a bad sign in a relationship, and then they quit. And then they get into a new one, and it happens again. And it happens again. And they chalk it down to it's not the right one. But the reality of the situation is this is just dopamine doing dopamine things. And so this is where the book begins to talk about here and now hormones, or here and now neuromodulators, which is things like serotonin and oxytocin. And so you've probably heard those two before, but serotonin is essentially released when you are happy with what you already have. It's like after a good meal when you're satiated. And so what's fascinating is that you can't have dopamine and serotonin at the same time because they are opposites and they suppress each other. And so when you have a lot of dopamine, you're going to have almost no serotonin. And when you have a lot of serotonin being released, you're going to have almost no dopamine. It's like being grateful for what you have and feeling super, super intense ambition at the same time. It never happens. I'm not saying never as an absolute, it cannot happen. And so a lot of people are driven by dopamine and they constantly want more sex and more money, and they're never satisfied. And the reason why they're never satisfied is, one, because dopamine is always forward looking and you can always have a bigger number. So always have more money or always sleep with more people. But what is more likely, or more so the cause of the unhappiness in these people, is because they don't have any serotonin. If you're completely driven by dopamine and wanting more and more and more, you never give yourself time to actually appreciate what you have. And if you're constantly in a state of dopaminergic euphoria, then you're never ever going to feel serotonin, which means you're never ever going to be okay with what you have. And so it's like a negative feedback loop. Is the more dopamine you get, the less grateful you are with what you have. And so, but then the more you get, then the more you want, which means that you're even more ungrateful for what you already have. And so it's this negative feedback loop of the more that you want, the less that you feel like you have and the more you feel like you need, but the less happy you will be with what you already have. So it's essentially just opposites. The more you want, the less you're happy you are with what you have. And the key is that serotonin is not like dopamine, and oxytocin is not like dopamine, in that it wears off the longer that it's around. And so when you get to a crossroads in a relationship and your choice is either jump ship and start a new one, and dopamine will fuel it for the first year or two, and then it will go away once again, and it is up to you to decide whether you want to jump ship again or you want to commit to the longer term thing, and it's a choice. And this is where it shifts from dopamine over to here and now molecules like serotonin and oxytocin. And the difference between these two is dopamine runs out. Serotonin is effortful and it does not run out, because it is kind of a choice. And so when you feel grateful for what you have and you understand that you are nurturing something that is important, it gives you a sense of inner peace. And that's going to be the serotonin and oxytocin that you feel. And so there's a point and a crossroads in life where you must pick between the two because you cannot have both. Because, like I said earlier, serotonin suppresses dopamine and dopamine suppresses serotonin. And so you can only have one or the other at a time. So, like today, I can be full of serotonin, tomorrow, I can be full of dopamine. But what I mean is, you can't have both as a lifestyle. So, if you're living a lifestyle full of dopamine, you can't also live a lifestyle full of serotonin. And so, the difference is dopamine runs out, serotonin does not. So inevitably, in order to have a long-lasting relationship in any case, whether it be with money or with a partner or anything, you have to choose the serotonin route. And you have to be effortful, and you have to be okay with not feeling exciting all the time and trading that excitement for peace. Because peace is the serotonin, and serotonin doesn't go away like dopamine does. And so if this is any relevance to you, I thought it was pretty mind-blowing because it explains a lot of the reason that most people think that the relationships die, but the reality is that dopamine's now run out, and it is up to you to try and foster that relationship and appreciate it for what it is and genuinely put effort into it. And by doing that, it will release a sense of peace or serotonin in your body, which you could argue feels just as good or better than dopamine at times. Now, dopamine is always exciting, and it's always going to be something that we crave because as a human species, we evolved for dopamine. Because if we didn't have dopamine, we would never get up and go get food in the mornings, and we would never like seek for more. And that's why we're so successful as a species, because we're constantly wanting more. But at a time in history where we have more than we ever need, wanting more is a detriment, not a benefit. And so if you can learn to shut down relying on dopamine and instead turn towards here and now molecules like serotonin and oxytocin, which you get from appreciating what you have and not constantly wanting more, then you will live a more peaceful and steady life. And that's not to say you should never rely on dopamine, because like I said, if you don't have any dopamine, you have no drive for anything else. And then you just become a couch potato because you're happy with what you have and you don't want any more. And so what you have to find is a clean balance of ambition, but also serotonin. And I know that's kind of counterintuitive to what I said earlier, but what I'm saying is you need to not let dopamine be your core focus. You need to be like 30-70, not like 100% dopamine, 0% serotonin. You need to be somebody, or I'm not going to tell you what you need to be, but historically, if you are somebody who is fully reliant on dopamine, then you will never be satisfied, ever. But if you allow room for serotonin and even allow it to take a majority, you will have a more peaceful life. And so try it for yourself and read the book. It's called The Molecule of More, and let me know what you think.